The slide, the current slide shows who we are. So I am Katherine Klosek, Director of Information Policy and Federal Relations at the Association of Research Libraries, ARL. And with that policy hat on, I'm going to kind of start out with a brief overview of some accessibility policy that we thought was important to kind of set the stage here. Of course, laws are not the reason that libraries are committed to accessibility and that, we do this work. But, we know that providing accessible materials that are needed for coursework and research to everyone who needs them in a timely manner is part of the library's mission. But we do think it's important, again, to just touch on two laws that you've likely heard about. One is the European Accessibility Act, or the EAA, which requires a range of consumer products to be made accessible by the deadline, which is coming up next month, June 28th, 2025. So for our purposes, I'll mention that the law specifically covers e-books and e-readers. It also prohibits technical protection measures from blocking access to accessibility features. And a really exciting piece of the EAA is that it requires accessible metadata. And we also wanted to touch on the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II, which recently has been adopted, and it incorporates web content accessibility guidelines into law by reference. So again, we wanted to touch on these laws because we hope they will accelerate born accessible publishing, which is something that the Canadian Association of Research Libraries and ARL have advocated for. Why is this so important? This slide really illustrates kind of the problem statement and kind of the global scale of the problem, which is that only 7 out of 100 books are accessible. So that means that most published works cannot be used by people with disabilities. They're not accessible by screen readers and things like that. And so that's something that we care deeply about and have been talking about and working on. And we're going to hear more of that work, I think, right now from Victoria Owen. So Victoria, over to you.
Thank you, Katherine, and good afternoon. My name is Victoria Owen. I'm an information policy scholar practitioner at the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto and a special advisor to the Dean on the accessibility of information at the University of Toronto Scarborough. So I wanted to talk to you about the project that we worked on together, which is why we're still a group that hangs out together and talks about accessibility. So libraries have mandates to provide equitable access to information, and we are key players in the practical implementation of the Marrakesh Treaty. And the Marrakesh Treaty is an international treaty that was agreed upon in 2013, and it provides for an exception to copyright for readers who are blind, for users who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled in countries that have ratified the treaty. It came into force in Canada in 2016 and in the US in 2019. It's an historic treaty. It was the first human rights focused treaty that WIPO ever negotiated, and it was the first users' rights treaty in their history. Other international legal frameworks that also form part of the environment that libraries operate in include the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which guarantees access to information and accessibility, and the Convention on Rights for People with Disabilities. So over 90% of the UN's member states have signed over on these two, the Covenant and the Convention. And so these are widely implemented human rights policies that governments are required to honor and put in their legislative frameworks. And these inform the work of librarians and information professionals in providing access to works for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. So libraries do have this commitment to equity of access for persons with disabilities, and yet we're a long way off from providing equity of access. And achieving accessibility on an equal basis with the mainstream. And this is one of the things that our task force really confronted and became aware of, because when we started, we were wondering why aren't libraries in Canada and the United States implementing this? Well, there are good reasons. It's complex, it's involved, it's multifaceted, it's nuanced, and it's interdependent on the work in progress of a range of stakeholders. So it, it's legitimate, but what we're trying to do is offer a way forward and start in a number of ways. And what do we mean by accessible? It means to be able to be used by people who have a disability. And accessible is also, as we stated a little earlier, a concept that's integral to human rights. And it refers to the absence of barriers that prevent individuals from fully participating in the social, economic, cultural, spiritual, and political life of society. So the Marrakesh Treaty created an exception to copyright with mandatory exceptions in national ratifying legislation, and it allows for the making and distribution of accessible formats. And it allows for the sharing of those works across borders. And one of the main things that drove this treaty was for the communities that produce these accessible formats, that not every country has to produce the same work over and over again, but that it's converted once and then shared internationally. And then that goes to then that responds to that slide that Katherine showed about 7 out of 10. Then there's a hope of making that number a little bit bigger. The treaty permits the circumvention of technological protection measures, so you can break the digital locks that some works have. And then each country develops their own enabling legislation that complies with the requirements of the treaty. And what this led to, and which added to the complexity that we refer to, is that it led to the variation in legislative language among countries. So even with Canada and the United States, we had different enabling legislation. In Canada, we added a commercial availability clause that just added one more barrier to the barriers that we've mentioned already. So the next slide, please. That we had a pilot project that started in 2020, and we had 4 pilot libraries who participated in it: Cornell University, the University of Florida, York University in Toronto, and the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales de Québec. Canada's a bilingual country, and we wanted to have both French and English represented in the pilot. So what we looked at in the task force was what the frameworks were in our libraries were in terms of policy around it, the metadata that supported accessibility, the systems, and how we worked with beneficiary groups. So we wanted to implement the discovery and delivery within each country and allow for cross-border exchange, and then identify and resolve the barriers that had been preventing the implementation of the treaty across in both countries. So next slide, please. The pilot revealed many, many challenges, and the final report included recommendations in 4 main areas. So that administrative commitment. So in order to achieve this, we really do need high level commitment, so that at the AUL level, the Associate University Librarian level in research libraries, that would be a responsibility for a high level position, so that had the authority to work across departments and work with systems and all the things that need to be done across silos that operate in libraries. And we needed to have advancement in metadata standards, because at that time there were no standards for accessible metadata. The systems had barriers, so that even if you had accessible works, they weren't discoverable. And we really did need to work more closely with the users with disabilities, so that we could really understand their needs and help resolve and move towards full accessibility. So for the accessibility metadata, I want to hand it over to Chris Oliver, who is one of our experts on metadata.
Hi, so I'm Chris Oliver. I was at the University of Ottawa and have been involved with the development of library metadata standards for many years. We were invited to report the results of the task force, and one of the times was during the conference of IFLA, and that's the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, at the conference in Rotterdam, August 2023. The finding about the lack of guidance for accessibility metadata evoked a strong reaction. Many had already noted this absence of guidance, and the recommendation to do something about this resonated with many people. So there were impromptu meetings and conversations, and the idea for a network began. People have come together mainly by word of mouth, and we became an official IFLA network in April 2024. And the interesting thing is how this network provides a place to bring people together from many different sectors and parts of the world who all feel very strongly about this work. But I'll mention a little bit more about the network later. Next, please. So what is accessibility metadata and why is it important? Accessibility metadata is simply information about the accessibility features or hazards that are part of a resource. It's information that helps a user with disabilities to find a resource that they can use and to find it efficiently instead of having to actually obtain the resource and then by trial and error discover if it's accessible to them or not. First of all, it's important for equity so that all users can have similar support in the process of finding what they need. But it becomes even more important when one considers that the amount of available accessible content is a fraction of what is available to those who don't have disabilities. But even if a resource has the accessibility features that someone with disabilities needs, if there's no metadata describing those features, then this accessible content is invisible. And if accessibility information is not displayed or cannot be searched, then this accessible content remains hidden to the person who needs it. Next, please. Dealing with accessibility features is complex because accessibility is not a simple yes/no questions. The needs of users vary widely. So for instance, two users come to the library looking for an ebook. They both have vision disabilities, but one has low vision, so they're looking for an ebook with resizable fonts and adjustable contrast. But the other user is completely blind. So the accessibility features they need are quite different. They're looking for an ebook with structured navigation for a screen reader to use, or for looking for output as electronic braille. So two users both have a vision disability, but very different requirements. So accessibility metadata must focus on communicating about the specific accessibility features or hazards that are actually present in that resource. Then the user has the information they need to make an informed choice about what works for them, whether it is in fact accessible to them. Next, please. But it's complicated. First of all, there's such a wide range of need. So that means a wide range of accessibility features that need to be described. But do we all use words, phrases, and terms in the same way with the same meaning? As we begin looking at how to develop best practices, one can see a need for rigorous vocabularies that define the scope and meaning of a term so that everyone is using it in the same way. A way to connect preferred terms and alternative terms that people may use for searching. And do any of these terms translate easily and well into other languages? A most important step that Victoria's already mentioned, is working with the user groups. So in this case, for example, choosing terms that have meaning for the people who are relying on this metadata. And of course, in this day and age, we need metadata that can be processed automatically, while also remembering that the display for humans has to make sense. Next, please. So the creation, delivery, and sharing of reliable accessibility metadata can be affected by many factors. More complications. So for example, in libraries, we have knowledge gaps. We know about metadata, but we don't necessarily all know about accessibility features, or how to evaluate resources for accessibility. If I reuse metadata created by someone else, and I'm not an accessibility expert, I have to trust this metadata. So we're seeing a growing interest in recording data provenance. Who created this metadata and when? Some external technologies like ebook platforms or automated ILL systems interfere with accessibility features. Or the reverse, the accessibility features may be part of a platform and only available if accessing the ebook through that platform. Next, please. It's very advantageous that there are multiple initiatives with a focus on accessibility metadata. We benefit from each other's work, even if we're coming from different starting points. A lot of this work is driven by the changing landscape. And Katherine had already mentioned EAA and Title II of ADA. So that is creating a legislative need that also impacts people beyond the immediate countries. And there also seems to be an increasing awareness that people with disabilities are entitled to a similar level of support as everyone else when they want to find a book or other resource. And we're realizing that if we want to achieve that, we need to pass along information about accessibility features of a resource. Next, please. There's already been a lot of great work. In December 2013, schema.org introduced a set of accessibility properties for the entity creative work. And this has had quite an impact, and it's greatly influenced the work on accessibility metadata. And here are two cases of accessibility metadata that was influenced by schema.org. The W3C publishing community has an accessibility task force that has published guidelines on how to use and display accessibility metadata for digital publications. They've just published a 2.0 version of their display guide. And this is an excellent and in-depth piece of work designed to guide publishers who record accessibility metadata for digital publications. The focus is on the end product. What's the information that should be displayed to users, and ensuring that this is meaningful and useful for those who need to find accessible content. And they've also published 2.0 versions of their techniques documents for translating metadata recording according to existing standards, right now from EPUB and Onyx, into user-friendly displays. MARC 21 is a widely used encoding standard in the library world. New fields were introduced in 2018 to record accessibility information and were revised in 2024. And there are indications that they will continue to be further refined. Julie will talk much more about this, but just to say that the 341 is intended to record information in a structured way, and the 532 is a more free text type of note. And both fields were influenced by the schema.org properties. Next, please. Some resources are born accessible, and that means that they were designed to include accessibility features at the time of publication. But there are also adapted resources. Educational institutions and accessibility organizations adapt resources by adding accessibility features to a resource after it's published or created, often in response to a user request. And these are sometimes also called remediated resources. And there's been an interest in recording accessibility information for adapted resources. There was the Mellon-funded FRAME project, federating repositories of accessible materials for higher education, that resulted in a prototype repository called EMMA, Educational Material Made Accessible. They started experimenting with metadata for the adaptation or remediation process. NISO approved a working group to take this further, to develop a standard for remediation metadata. It's called the ARM Working Group, or the Accessibility Remediation Metadata Working Group. Quite a mouthful. This work is still in the process of being developed. Next, please. As I mentioned before, another group paying careful attention to accessibility metadata is the IFLA Accessibility Metadata Network. The network's a new type of organizational structure within IFLA, and it's created a productive place for collaboration and dialogue between metadata experts and accessibility experts, between people working in many different parts of the globe, and between IFLA committee members and expert consultants outside of IFLA. The focus is on metadata that will make it easier for users to discover and identify accessible content. And there's no doubt that the focus is also on what is needed for libraries. But there's deliberate attention to what's happening in other sectors, so that our work results in metadata that can interoperate with the metadata coming from other sectors, so that all this work in the area of accessibility metadata can be utilized efficiently. The network is currently looking at guiding principles, crosswalks between accessibility metadata standards, best practices, and terminology or vocabularies. Next, please. So there are many sectors with an interest in accessibility metadata: publishing, education, libraries, organizations that create adapted versions. In this work, we can gain a lot from each other's efforts. Each initiative informs the work of the others. But there are also challenges, because we are different communities and we have different starting points. So interoperability becomes very important. And that means that attention has to be paid to alignment and harmonization between the accessibility metadata produced from different sectors. I'll now hand over to Julie, who will demonstrate some very interesting work with the Mark 21 standard.
Hello, I'm Julie Cardinal. I'm the former Associate University Librarian Cataloging and Metadata at Université de Montréal. I retired in October 2024, so it's still fresh. This is my first slide, because when we started our project of describing accessible titles, that's the reaction we got from catalogers. How do we go about cataloging and describing accessible titles? I'll reuse it. It's the starting point. I want to point out that Université de Montréal catalogs in French, so you will see a lot of French in my examples, but it's easy to follow and to know what it means, and I will explain it. So Chris mentioned earlier that accessibility content is invisible because accessibility features are not described, and the accessibility information is not displayed or discoverable. And those were the two main reasons that University of Montreal started to wonder how to change it. And we started in 2023 with the cataloging of our accessible titles. And there were a lot of challenges, you will see. A note, the examples will use the Mark 21 fields that Chris showed. and a few more. Like I said, we catalog in French, so you will see a bit of French, and we catalog in OCLC WorldCat and use the RDA, resource description and access. Next, please. Okay, this is the two main accessible field in MARC 21, the 341 accessibility content. It's used to record information about modes of access, the primary mode and the alternative mode. As you can see in the example, subfield A, textual, is the primary mode, so it's a text. And the subfields B is the alternative type of access. I don't want to go into details. I just wanted to show how we do it in MARC 21. Note also the subfield 2 is the code for schema.org. So all the subfields terms are from a control vocabulary schema in English. So it's one of the challenge we had to face cataloging in French. The second accessibility field is the note 532. It's textual information describing the accessibility features, hazards, and you have an example. It's a freely, it's a text. Everybody can read it. That presented the first challenge we faced at the University of Montreal using those two fields. In 2023, there were not a lot of examples in WorldCat on how to properly code the fields. So catalogers didn't know how to use the fields. Now it's changed. According to OCLC in April 2025, we're at 15,000 records having 341 field in the record and more than 45,000 records. But in 2023, there were a lot less than that. And catalogers do their cataloging by example. They follow what they see in WorldCat, and there were not a lot. So that was a challenge, and the reaction we got from the catalogers. But the biggest challenge is that we didn't have the expertise to properly code the fields. And, you know, accessibility features, we didn't know how to code them and to have an accurate description. So we wanted to have an accurate description. If our users want to find something that meet their needs, we need accurate description. So that was the biggest hurdle I think we had to overcome. We are lucky enough at the University of Montreal to have an accessibility service with a knowledgeable person there on staff that now support our catalogers, so that's not a challenge anymore. Like I said, we catalog in French, so the biggest challenge is having control vocabularies in English. And how do we translate that in French? You will see in a few slides how we did it. So next one. To all the challenge we encountered is the displaying of accessibility information. And so the workaround for us was to use those two fields. The 521, which is the target audience node. Again, I don't want to go into details of MARC and cataloging, but there's a first indicator, like I put in the slide, that is for special audience characteristics. So we use it to display to users the accessibility features. And also we have a data note, which I will show in the next slide, how we use it to display the 532 accessibility note to users. Next, please. This last MARC field is not a work work around the displaying of accessibility features, but it's a field that was in the recommendation of the CARL ARL task force recommendation. So in the record, you're showing that it can be used under the Marrakesh Treaty. So it's simple, and you know that you can provide a copy if a beneficiary asks for it. As I mentioned, okay, next one, please. I'll combine my notes. You see, again, the same book cover. This is our short display in our catalog. All university libraries in Quebec use WorldShare or CLC WorldShare. So that's the short view, the brief view in WorldShare. And as you can see, the arrow is pointing to the edition statement. Easy enough to read, it's the same in English, accessible edition, and it's a Word file. Because we're cataloging in WorldCat, and they have a script merging records for the same title, if we don't want to our record for the accessible version to be merged with the record of the ebook, for example, we need to add this edition statement. But the benefit of doing that is it's displayed to user in the short display. So that's an added bonus. And we're glad we're using it, even though it's not the proper way of cataloging and describing the resource. So next one, please. This is the metadata view, so that's the what you don't never see. And so click, Katherine. I just wanted to point out, you see 2, 3, 41 fields. Like I said, we catalog in French, so we have one in English using schema, and the second one is in-house translation in French. That will be probably not, we're not doing that for a long time because the 341 is not meant to be displayed. It's something we probably will use in our system for facets and filter down, and it will have to be translated in the display, but not in the metadata probably. So it's a work in progress. You can click. I just want to point out the 532, it's in French, but it says that all the accessibility features, and we basically copy paste the same information in the 516, so it would display to user. Click, Katherine. We are adding 385, which is the Library of Congress demographic group terms. There's also one in French. I left the 385 in English only, and that's what we copy in the 521, which is the audience field. And in French, it's also based on the control vocabulary, the répertoire de vedette matière. So at least we have something displayed to the user. And the last click, Katherine. And here you see the 540 note about Marrakesh. So you can go to the last slide. Again. Okay, and that's the view, the detailed view that user got from our metadata, and the arrows are pointing to all the fields I mentioned previously. So you have the edition statement saying it's an accessible version, the target audience, the note on accessibility, and the Marrakesh note. So that was our starting point, the catalog. That was an easy start. Now that we are getting better, it's still evolving. At the local level, we're starting to ask ourselves what to do for with our other library systems like OGS, like DSpace or Pressbooks. We all have content and we want to describe the accessibility features or at least inform our users that we have accessible titles. So we may want to start cataloging them as well. It's still in discussion. But I think we have a more organized working group at the partnership level. Our university libraries in Quebec are in a partnership, and there's a Marrakesh working group that will start its work probably in September. And that's in that working group that will probably establish the best practice for describing work, accessible work. We'll work with OCLC also for displaying accessible mark fields in the system, in the catalog. And we also will look at other systems, like I said, our repository or OJS, and because we're all using the same systems, how we can connect our other library systems so that users are informed of our accessible titles and they can request them. And like Chris said, we're working also to refine the MARC standard. So we'll work on that also in the next few years. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pascal Calarco. I'm a scholarly communications and systems librarian at the University of Windsor in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And, this work is also about bringing our peer colleagues together and seeing where we can do very practical things to advance accessibility in the systems that we use. And I thought I would point out a few things that I've been involved with that are examples of this. So in Ontario, we have a consortia called the Ontario Council of University Libraries, and that's 21 universities in Ontario, and 20 of us use the same library system, the Ex Libris, Clarivate, Alma, and Primo system. And we have an accessibility committee within that consortia where we've started documenting and tracking functional accessibility problems within those products. Clarivate has recently hired a senior director for accessibility, and through the user group in North America and in Europe, that person is starting to meet with members of our user community on a regular basis to review these things and remediate them. We also have done some programming to educate systems librarians and other professionals on the user experiences of low vision students and faculty. We've also started networking and making connections, like with our good friends in Florida, in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere who share similar interests. So these are some ideas where you can get involved and advocate for accessibility in the systems your library uses. Next slide. We also have been trying to do things differently in open journal systems. So OJS typically uses PDFs, but that's not to say that you can only just use PDFs. And we had one hosted journal here at the University of Windsor in law, and a legal scholar who is vision impaired asked if we could make accessible versions of the articles that were published in that journal. And so we started publishing, along with the PDFs, we started publishing in Word. So we had two different versions. And that's not to say that that would be the only thing we could do. We could certainly branch out and offer EPUB as a third means of making those works available. Next slide. There's lots of tools for testing accessibility, and the previous presentation shared some of these things with Pressbooks and DAISY tools. The DAISY Consortium Accessibility Checker for EPUBs Validator is a wonderful tool that you can use on Macintosh, Linux, as well as Windows, and it's kept up to date as the EPUB standard advances. So this is currently for EPUB 3.3. And we worked with Dean Judy Russell during the Marrakesh project to look at Pressbooks and some of the commercially available and hosted works that were published from University of Florida Press, and test these with the EPUB validator. And this actually helped the Pressbooks platform itself with making sure that the ARIA tags were recognized in the EPUB standard within Pressbooks. Next slide. So Pressbooks is a very popular OA book publishing tool. You can publish a lot of OERs and open access works through it. And it features the possibility of publishing in EPUB 3. And we looked at this impact of materials on society from simple book publishing, and offered some suggestions from the ACE validator, which was very helpful. And you too can try some of your own hosted EPUBs that you have in your university press, or things that you buy through your commercial vendors, and send that feedback and results back up to the publisher and hold them to a higher standard for producing fully accessible EPUBs. That's what it's there for. Next slide. DAISY gives you a lot of information on what is potentially wrong with an EPUB, and this is just a quick snapshot of some of the output screens that you get. So you can really get a lot of detail on precisely what needs to be remediated when you're looking at an EPUB. Next slide. And it actually gives you a violation report, which gives you more details on that here as well. Next slide. And just some more detail. So you can get lots of detail on what to do for a problem within an EPUB with DAISY ACE. Next slide. Another thing you can do is just follow along with some of the developments in accessibility guidelines and things that make their way into the systems that we use. And here are just some examples of recent publishing developments that affect accessibility that may or may not be incorporated into the systems that we use. But by knowing these things, you can advocate with your vendors about having these incorporated into those systems. Next slide. And I think this is over to Katherine.
Yeah, thank you. Catherine's actually. So I'm back to kind of wrap us up here. And I think along with Catherine McColgan, and I think we will do this briefly and leave some time for questions. So we wanted to summarize some of what you've heard here, just as far as sort of steps you can take, maybe, you know, after this presentation or after the forum. So we just heard from Pascal about kind of exploring about different tools that you can use to remediate and test content. And so we wanted to kind of reemphasize that. We heard about kind of University of Florida consistently doing this now, which kind of kicked off as part of their participation in the Marrakesh Treaty. And now it's something that is built into their workflow. So just wanted to kind of reemphasize that, and not just, yeah, like testing the content, but also sharing the results and using it to advocate with vendors as well. Catherine, what's next?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Katherine McColgan, Manager of Administration and Programs with the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, CARL. Nice to be here on this panel. Another thing that we can take a look at, considering are, just maintaining awareness of other initiatives that are happening in accessible publishing. We heard a lot about work that's been done with the metadata from Chris and field, descriptor field with Judy through other organizations. Pascal talked a lot about tools for looking at things. And he also mentioned just briefly about working on OJS. And so that was just the one thing that I wanted to highlight. And that is that the Public Knowledge Project, PKP, has issued revised guidelines to help making accessible content for the web and OJS available. So the Creating Accessible Content Guide covers the general principle of creating universally accessible content published on the web. It highlights techniques that can be used for visual impairment, the use of assistive technologies such as screen readers or sign language for those with auditory limitations. And it also gives specific tips on creating different galley formats in an accessible way. So the guide, can be useful for authors in preparing their manuscripts, and also for editors in formatting materials for publication and adding content to a journal website. Catherine?
Thank you. We also wanted to make sure that everyone knows about the Library Accessibility Alliance. It's likely that you do, but I just, we wanted to reemphasize this just in case there are folks who aren't aware of Library Accessibility Alliance and their great work, particularly their testing page. So they conduct assessments of vendor materials, resources, and the accessibility of vendor resources, and then they share the results with the public and with the vendors as well. So it's a really great, resource, and just want to make sure that folks are up on not just the testing, but also the educational and programming opportunities that Library Accessibility Alliance provides as well.
And then ask questions and share needs about accessibility within your library and with other, publishers and vendors. Find out who's the person or the people in your library that are responsible for accessibility initiatives. Try connecting with them, share with them what you do and what are the challenges that you're facing. Find out what publishers and vendors are doing that can and perhaps that information can be helpful in supporting the work that you are doing. Try, talking with scholarly societies and editorial boards to discuss how making journals accessible can get their work out to more students and more faculty for those who have print disabilities.
We also want to emphasize the importance of sort of leadership. Leadership is necessary to drive a lot of, to drive accessibility, accessible publishing, You know, in the Marrakesh Treaty Task Force, which we talked about a lot, you know, we were working with deans and directors of libraries. So the leadership piece is important, both to emphasize that accessibility, accessible publishing is a priority, and also because it's important to mobilize the different sort of departments and teams that are necessary to work together toward accessibility goals. If you in the audience here are in a leadership position, you know, modeling that advocacy is really important. And then finally, a little plug to the ARL's public policy briefing, which often includes updates on accessibility policy in the US and Canada. And where possible, we include kind of ways that you can get involved or educational resources and things like that. So that is, I'm going to stop sharing because I haven't been able to see the chat. That brings us to the end here. And I think we do have time for questions or comments and discussion. Thank you.